Hi there and welcome to this second lecture on the Odyssey. My name is Laurence. Today we're going to be talking about the Telemachy, also known as the Telemachyad from the ancient Greek Telemachia. So that's books 1 to 4 of the Odyssey, and they primarily concern Telemachus, hence the name. Telemachus is Odysseus' son. So, the practical purpose of the Telemachy. The Odyssey is about Odysseus Nostos, his return home, and Homer uses a composition, a structure called ring composition, which plays several roles in the Odyssey, and the Telemachy plays a particularly special one in this regard, a practical one, among other things. So what do we mean by ring composition? That is, the narrative of the Odyssey starts in the present and later it will go to the past. That is when Odysseus is talking about his travels with the sirens and the cyclops, etc. And then it will return to the present again when he is returning to Ithaca. So what purpose does the ring composition serve in the Telemachy? Well, for one, it helps Homer to dramatize Odysseus Nostos by showing there are problems at home. For one, we have the suitors who are courting Penelope. They are also eating away Odysseus' wealth. And thirdly, it is unclear what Telemachus' standing is in the house and what his future will be. Key to this is the fact that Telemachus is on the verge of manhood. So this provides Homer with ample opportunities for thematic exploration and the creation of dramatic tension and semantic nuance. Homer could have made Telemachus 12 or 13 years old, in which case he would have been too young to help his father on his return. That would have had the issue that the whole of the Telemachy would have been incredibly boring. Yeah, it would have been pretty much all focused on the suitors. Instead, Telemachus' age as a late teenager creates a number of questions that generate tension in the epic, such as his standing in the household, the oikos, as I mentioned, particularly in relation to his mother. Also, is Telemachus worthy of being his father's son? And how could he help Odysseus on his return? Another point of tension is the fact that the suitors hate Telemachus and they plan to ambush him. So will they kill Telemachus, and will we really get any further in the epic in that regard? So Homer doesn't make things easy for himself. By having Telemachus on the verge of manhood, he generates these questions. He also has to avoid the issue of making Telemachus steal his father's limelight. After all, Odysseus is the eponymous character of the Odyssey, and Telemachus should not steal his glory. So Homer does this really very well, actually, and he turns Telemachus' maturation into a key theme of the epic. A lot of it is covered in the Telemachy, but actually it's going to find its end in the last few books of the Odyssey. This will be something I talk about in the lectures, but also with some close reading in the seminars. So we can almost regard the Odyssey as a sort of Bildungsepos in this regard. So taking from the German term Bildungsroman, Bildung is education or kind of rite of passage in this regard. Roman is a novel, and epos is German for epic. So Telemachus in the epic, it's about his rite of passage. It's about his journey into manhood. And this is going to coincide with his father's homecoming. Got a nice picture of Telemachus here. So, yeah, again, relating to Germany, this statue is in Saarbrücken. There are also some more practical issues that Homer solves by making Telemachus' maturation a key theme of the epic. For one, he diverts the readers, or at that time his listeners, attention away from some unaddressed issues. For instance, why did the suitors arrive in the 17th year of Odysseus' absence, and how did they come to rule the household? Did someone help them? Were there disloyal maids or servants? Also, why didn't Odysseus' father, Laertes, summon help? And why didn't Mentor, who is, well, as the name suggests, he's a mentor to Telemachus in this case. He's a friend of Odysseus. He's also the disguise whom Athene assumes a lot of the time. But yeah, why did neither Odysseus' father nor a friend of his challenge the suitors coming and himself take charge of the household? So, talk a bit more about this in the next lecture, but related to solving these practical issues regarding time and the suitors arriving and Telemachus being on the verge of manhood, is the fact that Homer has Odysseus trapped on Calypso's island for 7 years. So the word Calypso actually comes from the ancient Greek name meaning conceal. There's a lot of plays on the meaning of people's names in the Odyssey. We'll see that particularly in Book 8 during the Phaeacian Games. So, yes, Homer knows that he has to make Telemachus interesting, hence he makes his maturation a key theme of the epic. How can he explain all this time that passes between the suitors, well, between Odysseus being gone, the suitors arriving, and Telemachus growing up? He strands Odysseus on an island with a sex goddess, the poor man. Okay, so coming to one of the first themes of the Telemachy, Telemachus standing in the oikos. So the oikos, translated as household, was the fundamental economic, political and social unit in ancient Greek society. It was a key concept, okay? It encompassed not only people in the house, such as relatives, freedmen, slaves, but even lodgers might have been included, also property, land, animals, etc. So the oikos was run by women, servants and slaves, but it was patrilineal and was headed by the most senior man in the house, known as the kurios. Wives normally moved in with their husbands into their house, that is, into their oikos, but they never relinquished membership of the oikos into which they were born, so they always had kind of dual membership in their husbands and in their birth oikoi. It's also possible that women, if their marriage was dissolved for whatever reason, they would move back into the oikos of their birth. It's important to remember that women, particularly in classical Athens, were supposed to stay in the household. Okay, that's why Euripides' tragedy Medea, he has her as the very first line. She says, "I have come out of the house." That is a strong statement in classical Greece. That means I am not doing what is expected of me. So the kurios was in charge of official relations, duties with the outside world, okay? But Telemachus hasn't taken charge of his oikos yet. The suitors are running rampant. They are eating everything. They are insulting Penelope and many of the serving staff. So currently, when we first encounter Telemachus, he is neglecting his duty. In fact, he spends his days dreaming of his father coming home and taking charge, evicting the suitors. Telemachus even describes himself as a weakling knowing nothing of valour. Athene, Odysseus' patron, chides Telemachus, saying, "You are no longer a child, you must put childish thoughts away. And what a tall and splendid man you have grown." So she does this in the disguise of an old man, Mentor. Okay, the name is not a coincidence. So Telemachus very quickly takes this hint, as you can see from where I have listed the book and line numbers. About 60 lines later, Telemachus goes up to Penelope, who has asked the bards to play a different song, and rebukes her, saying, "Making decisions must be men's concern, and mine in particular, for I am master in this house." Frankly, by this point, Telemachus isn't master in the house, but this is his future. This is the first symbolic step Telemachus is taking to become a man and to assume the role of Kurios. So, nice picture here. This is from from classical Greece, from 440 BC, and it's a boy playing with a yo-yo, so children in the oikos, essentially. Okay, moving on to the key Greek value of Xenia, meaning guest friendship. So this is one of the crucial themes in the entire epic. It was a very distinctive aspect of ancient Greek culture, and it recurs again and again throughout Odyssey. So Xenia was essentially a bond of trust imitating kinship, and it was reinforced by rituals such as the exchange of gifts. In Roman culture, this concept was called hospitium. So obviously that is where we get the term hospitality from. And, well, actually, hospitality comes to us through hospitals. So in the Middle Ages, hospitals were not primarily there for medical care. They were there to offer hospitality. A lot of travellers would stay in a hospital. However, what happened is more and more infirm and sick people started gathering in hospitals, particularly people with leprosy, and eventually they became a hospital as we understand the term today. But we get the term hospitality through hospitals in the Middle Ages, and that goes back to hospitium in Latin, meaning guest friendship and hospitality. So in social studies, Xenia is categorized as a ritualized friendship, hence talked about the ritual exchange of gifts. And it was an overwhelmingly upper-class institution both in ancient Greece and Rome. As I said, it's of paramount importance in the Homeric epics, not only thematically but also practically, because the hero abroad found a kinsman, a protector, an ally and representative in his Xenos. In fact, the Homeric practice of Xenia was, together with marriage, the forerunner of political and military alliances, and the emergence of the polis in the 8th and 7th centuries BC is partly thanks to this pre-existing web of interpersonal relationships that all fell under the umbrella of Xenia. So, lack of Xenia is also a key theme in the epic, not only in the Telemachy, but also later, for instance, when Odysseus goes to the Cyclops cave. Now, the suitors show no respect for the oikos and nor for Xenia. They drain the supplies in Odysseus' home, they speak deprecatingly to Telemachus, they insult Penelope, they court her. These were all offences that would have been recognised by a contemporary audience as violating Xenia, and the ultimate affront to Xenia, to this key aspect of ancient Greek culture, is the suitor's plan to murder Telemachus. So here is what Telemachus says to Mentor in the first book. So Mentor is Athene. Stay a little longer so that you can bathe and refresh yourself. Then you can go to your ship in a happy frame of mind, taking with you as a keepsake from myself something precious and beautiful, the sort of present that one gives to a guest who has become a friend. So this quote perfectly summarises expectations of Xenia. Yeah, not only the practical sense of taking a bath first and relaxing before you go off on your voyage, but also the ritual exchange of gifts between two Xenoi. Xenoi being the plural of Xenos. So a few other relevant things to this quote. We know from the Iliad and various other sources that Xenos was supposed to show concern for his fellow Xenos son. For example, to help him in an emergency and to save his life. And since Mentor, Athene, has just mentioned to Telemachus before he says this, that he once hosted Odysseus, Telemachus would surely recognise Mentor's help, his advice, as part of the bond of Xenia. So, Renaissance painting, here Giovanni Bellini, the gods would also exchange gifts of Xenia among each other. So typical gifts include cauldrons, tripods, mixing bowls, perhaps even weapons, and we'll see plenty of that in the Odyssey. Moving on now to Telemachus' travels and the Nostoi. So Telemachus' travels in the Telemachy to Pylos and Sparta accomplish two primary goals. They create tension, as the suitors plan to ambush him on his return, and perhaps more importantly, at least on a thematic level, it is time for Telemachus to start proving that he is truly his father's son and worthy of glory. So in Pylos, Telemachus stays with Nestor, who is king of Pylos. Now, Nestor is quite a familiar figure in the Homeric epics. He is extremely wise and immeasurably old. So he lived during the age of Heracles, for instance, Hercules in Rome, in Latin. And Nestor went round with Menelaus to assemble troops for the Trojan War. He is a respected elder statesman. In fact, he is the archetypal wise old man. It is quite fitting that he is the first person Telemachus goes and visits. In Sparta, Telemachus stays with auburn-haired Menelaus. He's king of Sparta. Now, Menelaus is the brother of Agamemnon, and it was Agamemnon's spouse, Helen, whose abduction by Paris sparked the Trojan War. So, although Menelaus was an effective fighter, he is a rung down from the greats like Achilles and Ajax, and in Euripides' tragedy, The Trojan Women, he is even depicted as weak and lacking the resolve necessary to kill his guilty wife. So, Telemachus, unsurprisingly, is treated by Nestor and Menelaus as an honoured Xenos, being the son of Odysseus. And yes, Homer goes on to recount what happened to other Greek heroes. So first of all, regarding Telemachus' treatment at the hands of Nestor and Menelaus, you were treated a bit like today, really. You were treated with greater respect and honour if you were yourself better known and held in higher regard. So just like visiting statesmen and women today to, I don't know, Buckingham Palace, where they're accorded all the honours necessary, etc. Now, not only does Telemachus learn from these heroes crucial lessons in Xenia, which he will need to know as household head, as the Kurios, he also learns about his father's heroic deeds. And this points to his own future. And yes, as mentioned, Homer uses Telemachus' travels in Pylos and Sparta to talk a bit about the nostoi of other Trojan war heroes such as Diomedes. Now, as I mentioned in the first lecture, Nostos means a return home, so the Odyssey is Odysseus Nostos. But the Nostoi is actually a lost epic that narrates stories of various Achaean heroes returning from Troy to Greece, and it formed part of the epic cycle. So there's some scholarly debate on why Homer has Menelaus and Nestor recount so many homecoming stories in books 3 and 4 of the Odyssey. Well, what may have played a part is the fact that oral tradition would have drawn on the various stories of the epic cycle, including this lost epic, the Nostoi. So the Nostoi are 5 books in dactylic hexameter, the same meter as Homer uses. Sadly, it only exists to us in fragments. And it begins with the Greeks getting ready to sail back from Troy, and it predominantly follows Agamemnon, who, of course, essentially started the war by going to Troy to get back Helen. Now, the last part of the Nostoi is actually narrated in books 3 and 4 of the Odyssey by Nestor and Menelaus. And as is so often the case with these really old epics, or generally texts from the ancient Greek world, both the date of composition and when the Nostoi was set down in writing are very uncertain. But the text was most likely finalized in the 7th or 6th centuries BC. And it tends to be ascribed to either Homer himself or to Eumelus of Corinth, so they both lived in the 8th century BC. But yes, authorship is also unclear. So the epic cycle is this collection of epic poems about the Trojan War, and there are a number of epics included. For instance, Cypria, which told the whole history of the Trojan War, meaning it commenced the epic cycle and came before the Iliad. There was also the Ilia Persis, which told the sack of Troy, and the Telegony, which concerned Odysseus' son by Circe. There were some more epics as well. Sadly, they pretty much all just exist in fragments now. So sometimes scholars include the Iliad and the Odyssey among the epic cycle, but typically this term refers to the non-Homeric epic poems. So although some claim that Homer also wrote the Nostoi, for instance, generally people do not believe that is the case. And there you go. That is the route of Telemachus down to Pylos and then to Sparta on the Peloponnese. So there are 3 key themes of, well, among the many key themes of the Odyssey are 3 which are almost always referred to using their ancient Greek names, Xenia, Kleos, and Metis, and we are introduced to all of them in the Telemachy. So Kleos really is the Homeric virtue par excellence. It means that true account of yourself that will live on after death and was achieved through accomplishing great deeds. In fact, Kleos is related to the word loud, and it carries the meaning of what others hear about you. So it's paramount for Telemachus to learn about Odysseus' heroic deeds so that he can continue and build on his father's Kleos. And this is because Kleos was transferred from the father to the son. And that is why Telemachus needs to hear the story from these other heroes, these other Trojan heroes. Yes, stories about the Trojan horse, for instance. That's Odysseus' best known stratagem. He needs to learn these so that he can take up his mantle later, prove he is his father's son, and importantly, thereby enhance not only his own Kleos, but also Odysseus. This is also, so this hereditary aspect to Kleos is also, for instance, why Medea takes revenge on Jason by killing their children, because this prevents his Kleos from being continued and built on by his two sons. Now, it also relates to why Telemachus constantly whines that his father probably died a pitiable death at sea, because if no one was around to witness Odysseus' death, and it wasn't a heroic death, well, that's going to bestow no Kleos on Telemachus. Yeah. So essentially, if your stories go untold, you won't hear about, no one will hear about them after your death, and you, yes, lose your Kleos. So we'll talk more about Kleos in the epic, and in fact the ring composition plays a very crucial role here, particularly when we get to the underworld. So as you might imagine, Kleos was mainly acquired through feats of arms, but you know, Odysseus is the man of many wiles, polytroupos, polymekonos. He was a man of words and trickery and schemes, hence the Trojan horse garners him so much glory. In a more traditional sense, Achilles, for instance, gained Kleos by avenging the death of Patroclus, his friend and likely lover. For Odysseus, it's mostly going to come through his wily schemes. This is why Menelaus recounts the story of the Trojan horse, and this is also why trickery and intelligence are such key themes of the epic, and there's going to be an interesting interplay between Kleos and cunning intelligence throughout Odysseus' stories. So what's also crucial for the epic, and also generally in ancient Greek culture, is the overlap between Kleos and Xenia. So if you have high Kleos, then you can fairly expect to be given more prestigious gifts of Xenia. This in turn highlights or enhances your Kleos. And yes, having spoken about the horse so much, there is a replica of the Trojan horse used in the film Troy. Of course, it might have been a clever strategy, but also it enabled the Greeks to sack Troy, and by sacking the place and taking all the treasures, etc., that also granted the Greeks Kleos. So that's why the Trojan horse was so important. Okay, coming on now to a more direct part of Telemachus' maturation, his role model Orestes. So I already mentioned that Telemachus is going to have to prove he is his father's son and help him to restore order in his oikos. Now, being praised by Athene and Nestor for his good looks is not enough. Telemachus is going to have to do something heroic, and there is a situation set up by Homer with the suitors who are showing hubris, who are insolent, who are abusing the oikos and the houses, well, Telemachus and Penelope, Xenia. And now we have the model for Telemachus to follow, that is Orestes. So Orestes was the son of Clytemnestra and Agamemnon. Now, when Agamemnon returned from the Trojan War, his wife Clytemnestra had taken on a lover called Aegisthus. And together, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus killed Agamemnon. So what it is then the duty of Orestes to do as his son is to kill Aegisthus and even his mother, Clytemnestra. This is what Aeschylus' three-part tragedy, the Oresteia, is about. And we also have the story of Orestes, well, told in many sources, such as the lyric poet Pindar. Now, in later tragedies, Orestes is actually put on trial for matricide, and the Furies, the Erinyes, they want to have vengeance. But in Homer, absolutely no such sentiment is expressed when Orestes is spoken about in the Telemachy. Okay, the heroes Nestor and Menelaus, they depict Orestes as someone totally worthy of Kleos, and even Mentor, so Athenian disguise, talks about Orestes. This is what Telemachus is going to have to do. So his mum might not have taken on a lover, but there is an obvious parallel between Clytemnestra taking on a lover and all the suitors courting Penelope. Now, that is Aegisthus being murdered by Orestes. And yes, that's on the oinokoie, so that's a wine jug, from the 5th century as well. So we know that for Odysseus Nostos to be realised and filled with Kleos, he must take control of his household again. And that is going to involve banishing or killing the suitors. In fact, Homer mentions Orestes so often, as I said, by Nestor and Athene, for instance, that you really can't miss the parallel. It is clear for Telemachus that he should take inspiration from Orestes. It is clear for the reader and audience that we should see the similarities between the situation of Orestes and the situation of Telemachus. In fact, in my opinion, the absolute lack of subtlety on Homer's part is a valid point for criticism. Okay, the last thing I'd like to talk about from the Telemachy is probably the single best known part of it. So, Penelope's shroud. Woven by day and unpicked by night, her shroud is proof of her metis, cunning intelligence, and therefore her suitability as Odysseus' wife. As mentioned, metis is another of the absolute key themes, key motifs in the epic, and it's introduced for the first time here with Penelope. So metis means cunning intelligence, and according to Hesiod, who was an 8th century BC poet, Zeus swallowed Metis, a woman, resulting in the birth of Athena from his head. Athena is the goddess of wisdom. Makes sense that she is born from Zeus' head after he swallowed intelligence personified. Now, Penelope's shroud is introduced in the context of how she has deceived the suitors by saying that she'll marry one of them once she has finished weaving this shroud. So we have this not told from Penelope's perspective, but from the absolute worst suitor himself, Antinous. He says that Penelope would whisper private messages to each of the suitors, saying she'd marry one of them when she was done. But yes, she tricked them for 3 whole years by unpicking the threads at night. This will not be the only example of Penelope's metis and suitability as Odysseus' wife. So there she is, one of my favourite artists, John William Waterhouse. That is Penelope working at the loom on the shroud. There are the suitors on the right. Of course, weaving was more of an upper class pastime in ancient Greece. I particularly like John William Waterhouse's picture of Narcissus and Echo. Very, very worth seeing if you've not seen that painting before. Anyway, Kleos turns up again because Penelope is weaving this shroud for Laertes for after his death. So this is to carry on his Kleos when he is dead. It's probably a story web, but talk a little bit more about that in the next lecture. Yes, in a pre-literate society, your heroic deeds went down in thread. Of course, they might go on pottery or frescoes as well, but very often they went down in thread, and that is why weaving took on such importance in pre-modern societies. Using an example from the Iliad, in Book 6, we have Queen Arete of the Phaeacians, and she weaves in her palace. There are 50 women at work on the loom in her palace. And to give you a historic example, in classical Athens, women wove a shroud annually for the statue of Athena Polias. It depicted the mythological battle between the giants, took them 9 months to complete, and was overseen by 2 priestesses. So weaving is actually when often marginalized women in ancient Greek literature acquired a voice and power as well. For example, Helen weaves a story cloth in the Iliad. The absolute prime example is the story of Procne, Philomela and Tereus. So a Greek myth, but the version best known is probably in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So Procne is given in marriage to Tereus, the Thracian king, and when her sister Philomela is coming to visit them, he abducts Philomela, puts her in a shack, ties her up, rapes her, cuts her tongue out, and leaves her there. He later allows her a bit of freedom in this shack, so cut her tongue so she cannot say what's happened, and she's trapped there, but she manages to weave the story of what has happened into a cloth and get a servant to pass this to her sister. And that is how she manages to speak, through thread. In fact, the ancient Greek tiktane comes from, well, it means to engender, and it's related to the terms textile and text, also via the Latin texere, which means to weave. So I wrote my master's dissertation about weaving, so specifically in relation to the story of Medea. So that's why I like talking about weaving. But yeah, there are even scholars who argue that Penelope is not just delaying marriage with this shroud, but she is writing the story of a woman's free will. And key to remember as well is that the 3 fates in Greek mythology are women. Yeah. So one draws the thread, and the other, well, one spins it, one draws it, and the other cuts it, cutting it, of course, representing your death. So Penelope was finally betrayed in the 4th year by one of her servants, who will be named later, but in book 2, when Antinous is talking about her scheme, the disloyal servant is not mentioned, but it does introduce this theme of which servants are loyal, which are disloyal, and that will become really important later, well, in the second half of the epic. Okay, that is all for today. Thank you for listening. In the next lecture, we'll be talking about Calypso and also Odysseus' stay on Sherry, which is the first utopia in world literature. It is where the Phaeacians live. Thank you very much.